Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. Today we welcome John McAskill, a retired Navy SEAL commander turned leadership and mindfulness coach. During his 24-year Navy career, he served in multiple highly dynamic leadership positions from the battlefield to the operations center and the boardroom. On today's episode, we discuss the strategies he uses and you can use to stay strong for your family. Enjoy the show. Hey, John, welcome.
Great to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
You know, we kind of tricked you here. We said we were going to talk about mindfulness, but what really we wanted to see was your reaction when Christian said he wanted to challenge you to a cage match. He said he's always wanted to take on a Navy SEAL, right, Christian?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. all my brawling and fist fighting experience. Yeah, it definitely be an even fight.
That is young John.
Yeah, in this day and age, you know, I'm almost 47. I've got 3 young kids, and wrestling them is my experience with cage fighting or any type of UFC type stuff.
I just love it. I love it. And John, this is kind of a serendipitous topic, I guess. We had on Dr. Voling from the University of Michigan, who's a clinical psychologist and a developmentalist. And she said that the most important toy that a child can have is the parent. And that for fathers, the best thing the parent can do is kind of roughhouse with them when they're younger. And she said it actually teaches them emotional intelligence.
Right.
Yeah. So she went on and on. She said, rough them up, throw them on the bed, do all of those things that we naturally feel like are fun.
Yeah. So what I've learned is, you know, little girls, they like hugs. And eventually little boys, they like hugs too, but eventually they end up parting from the desire to hug their dad. So wrestling is the way to get that physical contact with them, right?
Yeah.
Physical contact with your kids. It releases the same hormones that a hug does as an adult, right? The oxytocin, the serotonin, these love chemicals, and that makes them feel good. But absolutely, it teaches them that emotional intelligence. And my little boy, God bless him, he needs some.
Oh, I probably should point out for our listeners so they don't get confused. We're not talking about throwing your 3-month infant up against the wall here. Okay, so we're talking about hugs are essential when they're older and can walk and run. Okay, so we would love just to start out hearing a little bit about your career as a Navy SEAL, John.
Yeah, well, it's not as illustrious as many of my colleagues, but I served from 1996 until 2020. I was an enlisted sailor first. Not as a SEAL, but but I was a parachute rigger in the Navy. I worked on ejection seats in the F-18s, and then got picked up from the enlisted ranks, went to the Naval Academy. There, graduated in 2001, just a few months before 9/11. And I was at Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training BUD/S when 9/11 happened. And that's when the reality hit. It's like, oh, okay, this is very real. And I'm going to be in a line of work that is going to be heavily involved in whatever is next. And then, you know, I found myself deployed to wherever the other Navy SEALs have been deployed, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then I was in Panama for a little while. I did some time off the coast of Somalia. And very much enjoyed my time with the SEAL teams. Had a great time making some of the best friends that I have in my life, and worked alongside some of the toughest and bravest men and women on the planet. And had some rough experiences as well. Challenges with mental health, anxiety, post-traumatic stress injury, moral injury. And ended up retiring in August of 2020 after 24 years. So that's the quick down and dirty of it.
God bless you, and thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you guys.
And I loved your book, and I loved you said, I think it's BUDS. Is that the acronym?
Yeah, BUDS.
Yeah, I think that's the part of the book that I remember most, when it was, when you were walking us through that journey, and then how you take the strategies that you feel were applicable as a SEAL, and how you incorporate them into your everyday life. And we will get to that for the listeners, so you understand, if you have a stressful life because you're working, you have kids, and sometimes marriage is tough and rocky. We all need strategies to try to cope and work through things. So John's going to be here to talk about what he recommends and what works. And I've used what he recommends, and there's one in particular strategy that he uses that I love, and I've been using since he shared that strategy in the book. So anyhow, thank you again, John.
Yeah, my pleasure, man.
Let's get into it, right? Like when we think about Navy SEALs and Navy SEAL training, what they go, obviously it's a very physically demanding job. But as you alluded to, it's also a mentally demanding job, right? And so as we get into this, can you speak a little bit about how you've handled the mental switch then from being a high stakes operational mindset, or having that, to a more relaxed home environment?
Yeah, I don't know if more relaxed is quite accurate, just because, as I was saying, my little kids, they definitely give my wife and myself plenty of reason to practice mindfulness and meditation. Young kids, they're difficult, no matter how you look at it, and no matter what training you have. People always ask me, oh, you're a Navy SEAL, what's the toughest thing you've ever done? And I was like, being a parent, being a dad is infinitely harder than anything else I've ever done. But I did learn some coping skills in the military. I actually originally learned them on the shooting range to control my heart rate, to control my respiratory rate, and those were breathing exercises. But I didn't really think much of it. I thought about the physiology a little bit, but not a whole lot, and just did what I was told. And then years later, when I was struggling with some anxiety, and I went and saw a counselor, and I'll keep a long story short, this counselor recommended breath work to me, and meditation, and I ended up using it, and it was the same stuff that we had learned on the shooting range, or very similar, but we called it tactical breathing on the shooting range. And the practice that Brian was alluding to earlier is what's called box breathing, which is just breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 4, breathing out for a count of 4, and holding for a count of 4, and doing that 4, 5, 6 times. And that activates the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, which helps to calm you down, which helps to it helps to set you into a responsive state rather than a reactive state. And that has been a game changer for me personally and professionally, mentally and physically. And it's helped with my relationship with colleagues. It's helped with my relationship with my wife and my children, as I was talking about before. But it's also helped with my relationship, as woo-woo as this may sound, it's helped with my relationship with myself. And that's been a game changer for me.
Well, there were two things that hit home for me when you were sharing this in your book. And the first is, as you're sharing now, when you're on the range, any type of physiological response of anxiety or stress, you can see it, because your weapon is, just if it moves just subtly, you're way off the target. So you really have to be locked in. It had never occurred to me that translates into, managing the everyday stresses that we have. Because on the range, it's like right there, you can see it, but you don't see it in the real world. You feel it.
Right.
And so I thought that was a brilliant analogy. But as you were sharing these things, like one of the things that stuck out to me was the fact that just to take that second and go through, 4 seconds of elevated breathing, hold for 4, release for 4, that kind of box breathing, it just gets you to reset. And just taking 30 seconds or 60 seconds just to do that, to walk away, whatever it may be, in whatever frustrating moment that you're managing, makes a world of difference. So anyhow, I really appreciated that in your book, you sharing those two things and connecting them.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you got something out of it. I mean, even, the box breathing is great, but even if you can insert one intentional breath between the stimulus and the associated thought. Quite often that will change the associated thought, which changes the emotion that's attached to that, which ultimately changes the action. So just inserting that one intentional breath can sometimes be the difference between flying off the handle or having a more rational response. So breathing is incredibly powerful.
We're all sitting here box breathing right now. Awesome. Thank you. I'm taking that one straight to the bank, John.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service as well. I saw something on LinkedIn this morning, actually, about how in other parts of the world, when someone asks you, what do you do? Oftentimes the response has nothing to do with that person's work. It's more about their hobbies, their passions, the things that they're interested in. But in the United States, at least I've experienced this, when you ask someone, what do you do? The first thing they jump to is like how they, make a paycheck. And so I do think that we have some like lack of boundaries, between our work and our life. How and what strategies from the SEALs have you taken to maintain that balance between what you're passionate about, your family, your life?
I didn't learn the skills in the SEAL teams to separate life and work. As a matter of fact, I really struggled with that in the SEAL teams. I'm married twice. I'm on my second marriage. Hopefully this is my last. I want to stay in this one. I wanted to stay in my first one, but my wife then, in all honesty, complete transparency, that relationship was not my priority. And it was really hard to make it a priority. I thought in my mind that it was, but in actuality, the SEAL teams were number 1, 2, and 3, and then number 4 was far behind. And that's kind of a necessary evil, unfortunately, that there's a lot of divorce in the SEAL teams. But I learned to separate work from home and home from work later in life. And that had to do with the mindfulness and the meditation. What I try to do in the morning as I'm commuting to work, I try to do some intentional breathing there, as well as just a simple mindfulness practice literally while I'm driving. And that doesn't look like closing my eyes. Obviously, it's tuning into the rolling sound of my wheels, the physical and tactile sensation of the seat underneath my butt and against my back. And then once I park, I take a few intentional breaths, maybe do some box breathing, and then I walk into work and I'm able to leave home at home. And then vice versa, I do a very similar practice when I go home. I'm sure you guys have heard like people talking about, what is the man doing in the driveway? Like I've seen him pull into the driveway and he's sitting there for a few minutes before he ever comes into the house. Well, what I do is that I use that time to reset my mind, my body, and my nervous system so that when I walk into the house, I'm more present. I can leave work at work. I'm more present with my family. And I say that, and I also understand that I'm nowhere near perfect at that. This thing right here, the cell phone, that, I'm tied to work, as many of us are. It is a distraction, but now I've gotten my techniques down. I'll walk in and I'll lock some of the apps, or I'll turn off my phone completely, or maybe sometimes I'll leave it in my truck. And that allows me to be more present. But those are some skills, Christian, that I actually learned years later in my career. Now, it was still when I was in the Navy, but it wasn't through the SEAL teams. So yeah, those are critical skills to learn and apply so that you can live that happier, healthier, more fulfilled life. Because when you start thinking too much about work when you're at home, or vice versa, it can really affect the other. So yeah.
That's such a common problem now for folks who work from home, right? They're remote workers. It's hard for them to disconnect. Right. And I appreciate the strategies that you use, because they create not just the kind of energy that you need to be able to devote your thinking and your mind and your body toward your family, but it's almost like you've created this, you've compartmentalized work with family with this, with this wall of strategies. And the wall of strategies, this routine, allows you to remember this is family time. Work time's over, family time starts. And for years I struggled with that, and I didn't have anywhere near the responsibilities that you had. I can't wrap my mind around how difficult that must have been.
Well, I don't want anybody to minimize their responsibilities. We all have things that are going to stress us out. And again, coming back to what I mentioned before, there are times when I'm way more stressed now as a civilian than I was even on the battlefield. Like the battlefield, you have other men and women who are there with you. They know their responsibilities. They're grown-ups. They also know what's on the line. They know that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, then people die. So I feel, yes, there's a level of fear, there's a level of anxiety on the battlefield. But then when I come home and I've got other things, quite often that's more stressful to me. But yes, dealing with those stressful things, whatever they may be, whether it's the battlefield, whether it's, hey, did you pick up that gallon of milk that I asked you to get on the way home and then you forgot to do it, right? And I know none of us have ever been in that situation. but you can understand what that may feel like. But it's the what we can do with our body just by focusing on our breath. And then what that does, and we were talking about emotional intelligence before with roughhousing with the kids, that also allows us to connect in a different way emotionally to the other people in our lives. Like we can understand when we're getting upset and we can express that and say, hey, look, I'm starting to feel a little anxious, or I'm starting to feel this way or that way. And expressing that, not just with our bodily actions, but letting someone know before it starts to get to a point that's too high, or vice versa. If you see in somebody else an emotion that they're kind of trying to hide, you can say, look, this is what I'm seeing in you. Let's talk about it. And that quite often, it might initially upset somebody, but ultimately it can help to diffuse the situation. So as much as it does for your body, your mind, and your nervous system, it can also increase your emotional intelligence and your ability to communicate through these challenging times. Again, whether that's on the battlefield or whether it's communicating that you forgot to pick up that gallon of milk.
Mm-hmm. As a Modern Husbands podcast listener, you recognize the importance of evidence-based advice from leading national experts for your marriage. That's why we know you will love our marriage toolkit. Nearly 50 national experts came together to provide bite-sized advice to manage the toughest topics couples face in managing money in the home as a team. Go to modernhusbands.com for your free preview of our marriage toolkit to start, strengthen, or rebuild your marriage. Once again, that's modernhusbands.com to sign up for your free preview of our marriage toolkit. Now back to the show.
So let me ask, do you have like specific routines, rituals that you adapted that you're using to maintain, the sense of calm, the sense of focus in your home?
Yes. So I have several. One is I do try to meditate in the morning. I try to wake up in the morning earlier than anybody else in my house so that I can get my mind right before before the chaos starts, before the chaos with the 3 kids. And right now I'm living in an RV, my wife and 3 kids, so it gets pretty chaotic pretty quickly. But I try to get up earlier than everybody else, do that mental focus, and that could vary from 5 minutes to half an hour, and that can be a meditation that I get off of an app that's out there, or I could just be sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, literally focusing on the physical sensation of the warmth of the coffee, through my hands.
Do you have a favorite meditation app right now?
I don't have a favorite per se, but I use several. I use Calm, I use Insight Timer, and then there's another one called NuCalm, NuCalm. NuCalm isn't really a meditation app, but it's they play binaural beats through your headphones, and that has been shown to help to settle your mind or get you focused. And then, this thing, again, the cell phone, I do not that I'm here to beat up on the cell phone, but that can really take our mind off things pretty quickly. Like if we get up in the morning and our plan is to meditate and we open up an app, but then when we try to open up the app, we also see a little bubble notification on our social media or our email. And we're like, oh, let me just check this real quick. And before you know, yeah, exactly. And before you know it, you get sucked down this rabbit hole and you haven't set aside the time to do it. So I have my meditation app is the first thing that I open on my phone. I don't use my phone to wake up. If I use my phone to wake up, like many of us do, what do? We turn off that alarm and then we start checking social media. We start checking emails while we're still in bed, right? We haven't even gotten out of bed. And
that's not this morning.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and no judgment, Bruce, none. It happens. It's kind of a natural thing that we've built into ourselves now. We want to start reacting to emails and social media so that we're ahead of the game before we ever get to work. But really what that does is we set ourselves up into a reactive state so that when we do get to work, now we're kind of on this heightened alert rather than going in kind of calm, cool, and collected. That's one thing, as I try not to check my phone before I get out of bed. And I try to, do a meditation first thing. And then I also do what's called near sleep deep relaxation or near sleep deep rest after lunch. And that's another type of meditation where you basically allow yourself to get very close to sleep. And I will literally lay here on the floor in my office. Now, I have my own office, so I can do that. Now, if you work in cubicle world, people may stare at you a little funny, but getting some type of rest that recharges your mind and also settles your mind, settles your nervous system so that you can stay in that kind of green mode versus that red reactive state. So those are some of the things that I do, as well as the commute practices that I told you about before.
You mentioned earlier checking in with your loved ones or folks in your life about, when you notice a change in them. How do you communicate changes in your mental state to your loved ones?
Yeah, I'm not perfect at it again by any stretch. Brene Brown has this great video. It's actually Tim Ferriss interviewing Brene Brown, and Brene Brown says, it's a crock of what when people talk about marriage being 50-50. Any type of relationship is not really 50-50. A lot of the time, one person is going to have more energy, more wherewithal in that relationship, and being able to communicate that's coming home and saying, you know what, I've had a rough day. This is on my mind. This is on my mind. I'm not at 100%. I'm at 20%. And then the other person saying, you know what, I'm at 80%. I will help to pick up your slack. Or if you're both at 20%, sitting down and saying, okay, we're both at 20%. How do we work through this? I've tried to use that, and my wife is very good at working with me. She picks up my slack quite often. But yeah, I think just sitting down, even if it's just for a minute, and expressing, look, this is what's been going on today. I'm emotionally, physically exhausted. Or vice versa. You come in, you're like, hey, I've had a great day. I'm physically charged up. Where are you at? Can I help you out? I think that's just a very quick, easy litmus test, if you will, just to check in with one another.
I remember listening to that part of your book, and I've been married for 22 years. And I think that of all of the little nuggets of advice that are important to pass on, if you can share with couples the importance of even just reading their faces, you can almost see that look of exhaustion or aspiration. They when you know that they're done, when they're cooked, you can just step in. And I feel like that when you get to the point whether you can communicate openly and as you are, or read the face of your spouse and then respond accordingly, knowing I got to put in 80%, I got to put in 90%.
Right.
I think that in itself solves most frustrations in marriages.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And I'll also say that one of the worst pieces of advice that I ever got in relationship advice was, don't go to sleep angry. And that sounds great when you first hear it, but quite often in trying to solve problems when you're already tired. You start, speaking irrationally. You start really working emotionally. You're tired. You're worn out. I've always felt that it's actually better to be like, hey, look, I know we're struggling here. I know we're having an argument. I know X, Y, and Z. Let's sleep on it and let's talk on it tomorrow when we're both rested. And quite often, one, that space between the argument allows you both to settle down. And then two, now you're rested when you have that next conversation and you're able to speak more rationally. And I think that's a really good way to handle things in a relationship.
How does self-empathy come into play in terms of building up your empathy, as a spouse, as a father?
Yeah, so the way I see it, I actually work with compassion versus empathy, but there's some similarities there. The compassion.
What are the differences? This was really good when you shared this in the book, and I thought, wow, what an important explanation. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So empathy. Well, let's start with sympathy. Sympathy is feeling sorry for someone, right? You see them experiencing something bad. You're like, oh man, that's rough that you're experiencing that tough time in your life. Empathy is you see somebody experiencing something bad and you think, oh man, that's rough, but then you actually take on the feelings yourself. You actually experience them, physically experience those emotions. And then compassion is really taking it one step further. You want to offer a helping hand through that empathy. So I always say that compassion is the action arm of empathy. I don't know if that's exactly right, but that's my kind of definition. So compassion, the way that I see it is we don't have as much compassion for ourselves as we do for others. So our compassion for ourselves is down here. And for those who are listening and not watching, I'm putting up my hand in one level, and then our compassion for others is up here, which is higher than others. And I use this kind of analogy or story in the book where when Jennifer Lawrence, when she goes up to the Oscars, she's receiving her Oscar for whatever movie it was, but whether or not that was staged for publicity or not, that's irrelevant. But she goes up to receive her Oscar and she falls in front of the whole world. And, most of us, when we see something like that happen, we're like, oh man, that's so terrible. I'm so sorry that happened. That kind of narrative in our head. Whereas if that were us walking up on stage, being recognized in front of the whole world for our achievement at the pinnacle of our career, what are we going to say? We're like, oh, I'm such an idiot. I'm such a fool. These types of really hard things.
Yeah.
So we have very little compassion for ourselves. But when our compassion for ourselves is down here and our compassion for others is up here, I think that the difference stays the same. The difference between compassion for ourselves and compassion for others. So if we are able to raise compassion for ourselves, then that compassion for others gets raised as well. It's that old adage, a rising tide floats all boats, right? Well, if we start with ourselves, the way that we can do that is through mindfulness and meditation. And what happens there is when we sit down to meditate, we start to see who we truly are, the naked selves, right? Not literally naked, but the metaphorically naked person. Like, who are we underneath the armor, behind the mask, without the shield? Who are we? And what is it that we're experiencing? Well, more often than not, we're experiencing some type of challenge. We're experiencing some type of hardship. We're fighting some battle that nobody else, not our family, not our friends, nobody else knows anything about except us. And when you acknowledge that about yourself, then you start giving yourself a little bit of grace. And through that grace, you build compassion for yourself. And through building that compassion for yourself, the compassion for others gets heightened. So now you know that you're fighting a battle, and I know that you two are fighting a battle. And I know that everybody in this building that I'm sitting in is fighting their own battle. And that allows me to be more gracious and more compassionate for others.
First of all, very well said. And when I was listening, I listened to your book while I was working out. And what stuck out to me was that I am very guilty of being very hard on myself. Where I grew up, you're soft. Don't be a complainer. Don't whine. And I think like the challenge is that you don't realize how damaging that is until you hear stories like what you're sharing and have a logical explanation of the impact that has, not on just yourself, but on others. But something that really sticks out to me is about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a study done in the English Premier League, right? Because these players are owned, so they're investments. And so the club is trying to understand how they can get more out of their players. So they stuck heart rate monitors on the players, and then they had little microphones attached to them. And what they were studying was the impact of negative self-talk and positive self-talk. And what they found was that when players exercise negative self-talk, like, that was a shit pass or whatever it may be, that they actually saw elevations of their heart that were of anxiety, stress, duress. But then when they exercised positive self-talk, it reduced that elevation of their heart, which is important because, they're running, they're going,
Sure.
all game long. And then they showed the players, okay, here's what happens to your heart. And by the way, here's what happens to your performance. And you don't perform as well when you're really hard on yourself. You perform much better when you show yourself empathy. So it's such an important thing for you to share with others. I'm glad you did. Thank you for that.
I've never heard that study. I'm going to have to go look that up. That sounds really fascinating, and it makes sense, makes complete sense, but I would love to read that.
Manchester United, and I'll see if I can dig it up for you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
John and Brian, I'm reminded of just the phrase, like, I wouldn't talk to a friend like I talk to myself.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. And so taking that moment or moments, however long you need to really have that self-empathy is so, so critical to our well-being.
Right. Oh, for sure. For sure.
Hey, in your book, you also talk about how motion is the lotion. Now, can you tell our listeners what this means? How do you put it into practice?
Motion is the lotion for your body.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, so I have to attribute that to one of my business partners, and I'm not sure if she actually coined it originally, but Dr. Teresa Larson, she's a Marine veteran. I should have given her credit for that in the book. I neglected to do that. So Dr. Teresa Larson, yeah, I'm doing it now, right? She's a Marine veteran turned doctor of physical therapy, but she's not your typical doctor of physical therapy. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's just not what felt right to her. So she's going out teaching, being proactive in your physical health. So, stretching, doing some movement, those types of things to prevent injuries, or at least lessen the number of injuries and the depth of the injury. Anyway, she says motion is lotion, and she means it for the body, right? It helps when you move around. I have a walking treadmill here under my desk. I have a stand-up desk that I put up several times during the day. I have a yoga ball that I sit on, because even sitting there on a yoga ball, you're incorporating these muscles. It's great for your body physically. It works your muscles. It works your tendons. It works your ligaments. Your body needs that. Your body needs motion through the day. But I take it one step further in that motion is also lotion for your mind, because when you sit all day, there's all sorts of graphics for it. When you sit all day, your mind starts to actually almost atrophy. And when you get up and move around, even for 5 minutes at a time in between Zoom calls, you're releasing the same kind of cocktail of hormones that I was mentioning before, where you get a hug, you release dopamine, you release oxytocin, you release serotonin, and you start to feel better. But over and above that, your mind starts going again, starts moving, and it starts to think better. It starts to think more clearly. A lot of the time, I don't know if it was Steve Jobs or whom it was that said it, but they said some of my greatest thoughts, some of my greatest ideas, some of my greatest innovations came during a walk. So we can tap into this creative side of our mind when we move around, and that's the lotion that I'm referring to. The motion is lotion, like Teresa, my business partner, this veteran, Marine veteran turned doctor of physical therapy. It is lotion for the body, but it gets your mind going. It's lotion for the mind.
Now, we've had such a great conversation, but if we could boil it down to like one simple and actionable piece of advice that our listeners can walk away from this podcast with and employ in their lives right now, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say start slow, but stay consistent. So many of us, when we have the New Year's roll around, we have this great New Year's resolution of, I'm going to go into the gym for 2 hours a day and I'm going to crush my soul. And then within, the first 2 or 3 days, we don't go back to the gym. Well, the same thing can happen with mindfulness and meditation. If you try to sit down for an hour-long meditation the first day, most likely you're not going to meditate the next day. So start small with some box breathing, like Brian and I were talking about. Start small with some very short meditations, 2, 3, 5 minutes, and then stay consistent with it. And that's when you're going to start to see the changes. So start small and stay consistent.
What a great conversation. And listeners, I'm going to be sure to share all of the links that we brought up, like the new Calm app. I've got that prepared. Obviously a link to John's book and a direct link to where you can purchase it. And the name of his book is Unleashing Inner Strength, a Navy SEAL's Guide to Preparedness, Resilience, Grit, and Compassion Through Mindfulness. And then, well, it is, yeah, I had to sound out a couple words. And then then if I can dig up that study with Manchester United, I'm going to include that as well. And we also, for those of you who just follow our podcast, we also share the podcast with some additional information on our website, modernhusbands.com. John, thanks so much for being here. Most importantly, thank you for your service.
Thank you, guys. Honor and privilege to serve, and an honor and privilege to be here with you guys today.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow Modern Husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.